Hi, I'm Kate Pickett. I'm Professor of Epidemiology at the University of York, and I'm the co-author with Richard Wilkinson of The Spirit Level and The Inner Level. And I'm speaking from just outside of York in my study.
Hello, I'm Michael Sheen. I'm an actor. I'm also the president of the Wales Council for Voluntary Action. I'm the vice president of the Royal Society for Public Health. I'm the patron of Social Enterprise UK. I founded the End High Cost Credit Alliance, and I delivered the Homeless World Cup in Cardiff in 2019. And I'm speaking to you from my kitchen in Wales.
Hello, my name's Andrew Sims. I'm an author, a political economist, campaigner. I coordinate something called the Rapid Transition Alliance, which is all about evidence-based hope in a warming world, run a think tank called the New Weather Institute, and am Assistant Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility.
Hi, my name's Fatima Ibrahim. I'm a campaigner and climate activist. I'm also the co-founder and co-director of Green New Deal UK, and I'm in my home in Northwest London.
The concept of the flip, as I see it, is to allow us to believe in the possibility of radical change, because at the moment we're living through a moment that allows us to see the potential speed and scale with which we can respond to a problem. We've been stuck with the climate emergency, with corrosive inequality for such a long time. And now we can see that when the stars align, we can mobilize extraordinary levels of resources and change our behaviors overnight to respond to a problem. And if we can do it now in the face of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, there's no reason why we can't do that in our response to the other fundamental system challenges that we face at the moment, like inequality and the climate and ecological emergency.
I think it's almost like Maria Montessori says about teaching children, that you have to wait for the teachable moment. And this feels like a teachable moment for me. It's clear that we need to change what we're doing, that we do need to flip the way we think about our economies, the way we think about the planet, but the way we think about our societies as well. And this is a moment, I think, when we could see some real change. We failed to flip after the global financial crisis. We flipped quite positively after the Second World War. And this is another moment, I think, when we could see, as Andrew says, radical change, profound change in the way we do things.
So for me, I think times of crisis sort of provide an opportunity for us to sort of have a real look and challenge our fundamental views, our worldviews, what we believe to be the case. Whether that's crisis on a personal level or whether it's a society crisis, it really challenges what we thought was the case. What is possible? What do we actually value? What are the support systems that exist? And I think that's what's happening. That's the flip that we're seeing, is that our worldview is changing. There's a new common sense emerging, and social change, if we see it as a sort of physical movement that's bound by a sort of gravity, which is a worldview of this is how things must be, that gravity is sort of falling away. The resistance to that physical movement is weakening. And I think there's an opportunity for there to be a flip in a positive direction. There will be a flip regardless. And I think that's what happens in times of crisis. It's just what direction that flip will be is the bit that's contested right now. And by all means, that flip is happening in a positive direction for the moment.
For me, the flip is not so much about something new happening or reinventing the wheel in any way. It's about something being revealed that we already knew to be true, but we can't argue against anymore. We can't pretend that it's not the truth. In the same way as this concept of key workers that has suddenly emerged. We always knew the people who really were keeping things going, and now you can't argue it. It's just reality. Hitting ideology, I suppose. And now it's going to be a lot harder to argue against supporting those people and those groups. So I suppose the flip is about, for me, is about actually being able to support what's already there and working and being effective in incredibly difficult circumstances. And now, hopefully, there'll be more of an appetite to support that.
While Michael was speaking, you just reminded me of one of the things which I had which I think has already flipped in a sense. I realize I almost like a mantra, I used to kind of begin all of my talks with the phrase which has been so resonant in recent years that it's been attributed to at least half a dozen different people on the World Wide Web. And that's the idea that, you know, it's been easier to imagine the end of the world than a fundamental change to the economy that we're living with. And I kind of think, well, until now, I've never seen before across such a wide range of different political systems, the emergence of a consensus that public health and well-being comes first and comes before short-term economic interests. And we've kind of seen that from the kind of the grassroots up, from the power of communities coming together with mutual aid, right the way through to a really obviously enabling power of government, which we've been kind of led to believe didn't exist through all the years of austerity in the UK. And we've seen how public space matters and how the public sphere underpins everything. And I think that tees us up for a moment when a flip becomes more possible than it has been in living memory.
It's almost like our social microscope has got a sharper focus, isn't it? And we see in even clearer ways things that we already knew. So, you know, even before the coronavirus crisis, we knew that inequality was a huge problem. You know, we knew that it was linked to health problems across the world. You know, people are more likely to have poor physical and mental health in more unequal societies because of chronic stress and the biology of chronic stress. But also we know that, you know, children's life chances were poorer in more unequal societies. So although we talked all the time about wanting kids to have equal opportunities, the reality was that they didn't. And we know that inequality destroys the social fabric, so that, you know, there are lower levels of trust, less solidarity in more unequal places. We knew all of that, but all of those facets of what inequality does are sort of being brought into sharp relief, I think, during this crisis. And of course, those differences were always, they were huge. You know, more unequal societies do a lot worse than the more equal ones. And they affect all of us, not just the poor. But somehow we managed to sort of pull a veil down over that. And I think now that veil is being lifted in ways that it wasn't previously.
I'm a climate activist, and people are often sort of questioning whether this is the time to be talking about climate change, or whether there is like a conversation about climate change that's linked to the coronavirus. And fundamentally, what the coronavirus, I guess, has shown us is like that inequality is the heart of our economy, and the social violence that comes from inequality. I've often said to people that the coronavirus is both illustrative and instructive in what we need to do with about the climate crisis. Just at the early stages of how we were dealing with this crisis, we were told to social distance. And social distancing very quickly became obvious as a luxury, something that not everybody was able to do. It required you to have a home that you could distance yourself in. You really had to have an income to be able to leave your job. We needed healthcare systems that were able to support us. We needed a social immune system that was able to support us. This links to the climate crisis because what inequality has done is it's made us vulnerable to crises, and it's exacerbated the effects that it's having on our societies. The climate crisis is essentially an inequality crisis, and I've slowly come to the opinion that inequality is driving and is one of the core drivers of the climate crisis, that it is fundamentally an issue of who has power, whether it's actual power to make decisions, who has access to resources. Wealth inequality is a big part of it. If you just see across the spectrum, where are the biggest carbon emissions coming from? In the global north. Where are the biggest carbon emissions in the global north coming from? A certain section of society. I saw something on the news just maybe 2 days ago about, you know, we're all stuck at home, but there's still carbon emissions. And finally, we're seeing that the lie of individual action is not the thing that's going to allow us to stop runaway climate change, that actually there is structural inequality that is driving climate change, that these emissions are structural decisions and political decisions, that they aren't things that people are doing to enrich their lives. There are people who are being enriched by the climate crisis, who are fueling it, and it isn't us it is enough that are stuck at home. So inequality for us, which is why, you know, we started the Green New Deal campaign. The Green New Deal is fundamentally linking the climate crisis with the inequality crisis and economic injustice. That without tackling all three of them, that we're regardless going to steam right into runaway climate change. That if we give power to local communities, if we decentralize power, that people are able to make decisions on how, you know, their environmental futures, their economic futures, how they want to run their communities, what they want to prioritize, that collectively we are better able to manage our resources. And for me, that's the conversation we need to be having now, in terms of how do we make sure that when we're rebuilding an economy, that we're doing it in a way that stamps out inequality and gives power across the board to people to effectively manage our collective resources, and in doing that, allow us to steer away from the climate emergency.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I was delighted when inequality was included as one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. But that's, you know, I love those goals, but they're just a dashboard, and the interconnections between them are missing. I think inequality is sort of at the heart of achieving all of the other 16 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think you're spot on.
As we speak today here, the Office for National Statistics released figures today saying that the number of deaths from COVID-19 in deprived areas is double the amount in more affluent areas. And we also know that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are being affected and dying at a much higher, certainly disproportional rate to others. So deprived areas and more deprived communities are being hit hardest, and BAME people. So it's not that different to pre-pandemic. When people say that inequality is just exacerbated by crisis, I think we're seeing that happen. And there are all kinds of complex reasons for that, but certainly over a decade of austerity policies has stripped public services back in the more deprived areas for people who are working on the front line of healthcare, social care, the people who are actually, having to deal without social distancing in the first place, which, a lot of the time are people, BAME people. We're seeing the effects of that now, and it's leading to direct deaths. I mean, it's led to illness, health issues, mental health issues in the past, and deaths. But we're seeing that in a very sort of stark way at the moment. If people don't have any savings, then going through this period of time is incredibly difficult. People who have relied in the past pre-pandemic in order to get through crises that to them are big crises, like a washing machine breaking down or a car breaking down, or having to get school uniforms for your children in the start of the new term. Those can be very difficult moments that they need some help. And if they don't have access to fair and responsible credit, like most of us do, then you end up relying on things like exploitative high-cost credit providers, doorstop lenders, payday lenders, rent-to-own businesses, and people start to get into all kinds of debt spirals that affect them, their mental health, their physical health, and going into something like this pandemic with a major crisis, a lot more people are going to need help to get through that. And for all that the government is trying to help and saying what they're going to do to help, a lot of people need a lot of help to get through this. And that is going to continue for, I would imagine, a very long time. So that inequality, the people who were already suffering on the margins, the people who are already marginalized, the people who are already suffering from mental health issues, the communities that were already really struggling because of austerity, I think as more and more people are going to need to rely on things like universal credit, the pressure that it's going to put on the people who are already suffering is going to be really, really difficult. We're seeing a rise in domestic abuse, obviously, during this period of time. We're seeing mental health issues obviously becoming really difficult. And so not only does what happened before the pandemic came along and the inequalities that were there become exacerbated during this period of time, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen afterwards, because we're seeing that money is available to help and support people, but that it ain't coming from nowhere, and it's going to be paid back. And in the same way as supposedly, you know, the money that was there to bail out people during the financial crisis ended up being paid for by those who were already being hit the hardest. My worry is that after this, the money that is going towards helping us get through this, we have to make sure that those who are already struggling the worst don't end up paying the most for this in the long term.
It's just sort of to come on, yeah, I think austerity has almost become like a normal, and I mean, it's a normal for me. I grew up through austerity, that we sometimes forget that austerity came off the back of a crisis that wasn't caused by the average person, and that we have paid the price for it. And that when there comes a moment to bail out and there will be some sort of stimulus to get the economy back on its feet, that it isn't us that pay for it all over again. And I don't believe, and I think the sort of the normative economics tell us that we are driven by greed and selfishness, which George Monbiot, I think, covered in the first episode of The Flip. And I agree with him. I don't agree that this is the key driver of humans. But even if it was, even if we were selfish and only cared about ourselves, one thing is true: we're only as strong as the weakest in our society. Our ability, and coronavirus has shown that we're all at risk as long as there are people who are suffering from this disease. And inequality has shown quite plainly that it is not only a pre-existing condition, it's also a super spreader. That the communities and the people who are being hardest hit are the communities that are left behind, because the social infrastructure that's supposed to be there to help protect them isn't. So in both cases, it's kind of hard to understand why it isn't common sense to make sure that there is social protection for everyone, because it not only benefits community as a whole, it benefits us as individuals and protects us as individuals. And I think it's definitely worth remembering that austerity isn't just a normal part of everyday life, that it is a political decision that's happening and has been happening for 10 years or so.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were really unaware of the profound effects that austerity was having on the population's health prior to this. You know, it wasn't talked about that much, but actually we'd seen infant mortality rates going up. You know, we'd seen life expectancy gains grind to a halt, and for some age groups, you know, mortality rates increasing. And yeah, inequality is a super spreader. I think that's a great phrase. There's a lot of research starting up on trying to understand the differences that we're seeing in rates of infection and then in high morbidity and death rates among Black and minority ethnic populations. My hunch is that it will be explained by things like deprivation, overcrowding, low pay, being more likely to be a kind of key worker on the front line, and all of the other sort of social things that go along with being in a minority ethnic group in this country. I don't think we're going to find anything profoundly interesting genetically, although they'll look, but I don't think they'll find.
When you're trying to squeeze everyone who's already here on the planet into the shoe size of the planet, if you like, you can't do it by having more or even continuing the levels of overconsumption that we see among global elites at the moment, and meet the needs of people who don't get their basic needs met. So unless someone's going to turn around and argue that you're just going to leave people around the world with nothing, equality is central. It's a question of maths. I mean, yes, it's a question of values and morals as well, but it's also, there is no other way to solve our collective crisis than by having greater equality. And one of the other reasons, of course, is that when the fabric of society is stressed by a crisis, we know, as has been mentioned a few times already, that unequal societies have got a horrible habit of falling apart. We know that high levels of inequality historically have prefigured economic crashes as well. I think there's another kind of tempting argument that you hear sometimes, this idea that somehow having inequality is a sort of beneficial cultural trait that, that allows for innovation and efficiency and increases your chances of survival. But actually, I think the evidence, and the evidence of past civilizations, shows that exactly the opposite is true, that unequal access to resources is it's a very destabilizing thing, and it kind of raises the chances of group extinction, if you want to use the language of science. And I think it's very interesting that another reason why I think it kind of matters very much at the moment is that deep down at heart, greater equality is what people really want. And it begins from a perception, an important perception. There's a behavioral economist called Dan Ariely who did a very good exercise where he got people of all political persuasions together and asked them how unequal they thought society really was. And across the board, we generally tend to assume that societies are more equal than they actually are. And that's especially the case in the very sort of Anglo-Saxon economies like the UK and the US. So we have a misperception of how bad the problem of inequality is. So deep at heart, I think there's a kind of a very human desire for things to be more equal. And I was one of a small group of people with a guest on this program last week, Caroline Lucas, that wrote the original Green New Deal back in 2008. And we had a triple crisis then. We had a climate emergency, we had a high oil price spike, and we had the banking crisis. And we thought that we could tackle the triple crunch that was beautifully described by Fatima earlier with a huge investment in low carbon transition that would create better quality homes, tackle fuel poverty, create jobs around the country where they were most needed, at the same time as insulating ourselves from the vagaries of the international energy markets and tackling climate change at the same time. And we've had demonstrated that, yes, indeed, there is a magic money tree. There always was. They disguised it before by giving it a technical name. They called it quantitative easing. And instead of spending it on something useful, the money washed up in inflated commercial property prices and the prices of luxury goods. And we now know that had we invested that instead directly in low carbon transition, job creation, safe homes for investment in terms of looking at renewable energy and the retrofit of our homes to make them more pleasant places to live, we could have tackled all kinds of economic problems and the climate problem, the resource problem at the same time. So now is a moment when we have to act. We can learn from the past about what we did wrong before, and we can tackle simultaneously several problems at the same time.
It's interesting, Andrew, that you said that people tend to think that society is more equal than it actually is. And Fatima, you mentioned earlier on about coming out of World War II and there being a sort of a flip that happened then, and it reminds me of with the Brexit referendum vote, that there was a moment that was such a not a moment, it was such a shock that there was a sudden revelation of what was actually going on in the country on a scale that was very different to what a lot of people thought it was, that a certain reality, and it may have been a very unpalatable reality for a lot of people, but a reality nevertheless kind of broke through into the mainstream thinking of the country, and we just had to deal with it. And we are still dealing with it. We were still dealing with it, although the pandemic, has sort of taken the front page and the bandwidth of thinking about it. But that reality, that idea that somehow there is a sense, a kind of a shared illusion or a shared belief about us and who we are, and certain people have more of a say in that than others too. Certain groups, certain people, certain areas of our society have more influence over what is our shared belief about ourselves. But there are certain moments where reality just smashes through that, and everyone has to just deal with what is really going on. And I think in a way there is hope in that as well, because at least we're dealing with reality then. If people are able to have the kind of, in a way, it's because of how brilliant the advances have been since the Second World War, the creation of the welfare state, the creation of the NHS, the fact that we are a society, a culture that gets older now, that we're able to survive. All those things have in some ways given us a kind of a decadence, or at least the ability to not worry about certain things as much, or to allow a version of who we are to settle on us and not see the reality of it. But in the same way as World War II meant that people were forced to deal with the reality of what was going on in our country, and then out of the experience of World War II had an appetite to change it. I think there is potentially the same thing going on now, that it's becoming very clear what the inequalities are, and I think they're going to become even more clear.
I think a lot of people get this internationally. I mean, there are groups working all across the world thinking about alternative new economies. I work with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Club of Rome. IMF is starting to get it. The OECD understands inequality. And then locally, I think there's quite a lot of awareness. Amsterdam has said they're going to use Kate Raworth's donor economics model to guide their recovery. And the local authority that I work with in Bradford probably are going to do the same. But our Conservative cabinet, they don't get it. You know, if you look at what Boris Johnson has said about inequality in the past, he doesn't understand it. And I'm not so sure that he'll get it, even having had that experience of being cared for by key workers through a health crisis of his own.
Oxfam comes out with its inequality report every year. And what's interesting is that, you know, quite often what you'll find is the wealth of the top, 26 people has grown at the same rate the wealth of the bottom 50% has decreased. And there's this force that's happening, and economists that study inequality often say it's the top 20% that squeeze the bottom 40%, and actually the middle 40% is quite stagnant, stays the same decades on end. And that's what we need to, it's like this extreme sort of, some people are taking and like the bottom 40% are losing out. And that's the level of inequality I think people don't quite understand. We're not talking about small numbers. I mean, we are talking about small numbers of people who are taking wealth away from the vast majority of people.
I know, it should be easy to round up those 26 people at the top. Force them to hand it over.
Just to relate that to the kind of the climate emergency, is absolutely striking, the inequality in terms of the impact of our lifestyles and our consumption patterns, when you consider that the richest 10% in the world are responsible for around about half of all carbon emissions, whereas the poorest half of the world's population are responsible for only about 10% of the world's emissions.
And it really varies across countries, doesn't it? So if you look at even rich Indians emit less carbon than poor Americans. So stark inequalities between countries too.
And I am responsible for 95% of the world's films about real people. I don't know if that's a statistic that's meaningful at this point.
The magic money tree exists after 10 years of being told it doesn't. Suddenly the government does have money to respond to a crisis. And what's clear is that we need to believe it's a crisis in order to spend the money. And who needs to believe it's a crisis? The government needs to believe it's a crisis.
It's a useful reminder that as we came out of the Second World War and went through that process, that amazing 3 years in which the NHS were built, and as we went on to build homes, social homes, homes for heroes, at an incredible rate of over 200,000 a year under both Labour and Conservative administrations. But as we came out of the war, Britain was indebted to the tune of about 250% debt to GDP. But in 2018, debt to GDP was somewhere just over 80%. So we achieved these sort of epic things at a time when the country was kind of riven and kind of stumbling out of an extraordinary crisis. And I think we often forget what we're capable of.
For me, the biggest thing that has flipped is just public acceptance and conversation, that this is no longer a conversation that's happening around, in an elite, around campaigners. People are having these conversations around their dinner tables. My parents and I are discussing like how society is shaped, how unfair society is, who is making decisions, what is the type of world that we want on the other end of this, what are the type of jobs we want, what do we value, that more value should be placed in different types of work, that we want a care economy, that there's too many people propping up our society that are not being paid or are not being valued. And for me, that's the most fundamental flip, is having especially come out of an election just a few months ago where there was a political party trying to make the case that we needed a change from the status quo, that 10 years had left our society vulnerable and weak, and it was hard to sort of break through the Overton window and tell people or convince people that there is another way of doing this, and that actually what the election showed us is the biggest barrier to change is our ability to believe that things can change. And I think that's the biggest flip that's happened, is that people in their homes, with their neighbors, with their family, are changing their ideas of what's possible. I think one of the things we'll reflect on years on from now is how the coronavirus shocked us into doing something that we've been trying to do for a really long time, and that if anything come out of this crisis, and if any way we can remember all of the people that we've lost and start valuing the people who allowed us to get through it, is to make sure that we don't go back to normal and recognize that normal as it was a crisis in itself.
Yes. There's nothing like the potential imminent death of yourself or your loved ones to focus the mind on what are your priorities. I think I totally agree that there is a conceptual, psychological breakthrough that happens or that is happening at the moment about what is possible. What is it that we can do as a society? You know, I think a lot of people, including myself, a lot of the time you do think, well, it's just, you know, change, it's not going to happen. It's too enmeshed, we're too bogged down, and then suddenly, bang, in the blink of an eye, everything's different, and suddenly things are happening that you didn't think could happen. Again, like we kept coming out of World War II and that vision that changed our society in such an extraordinary way. But also on a more local, literally local level, the possibility of what communities can do. Again, I think it's something that was already going on, but it's been revealed and kind of pumped up during this crisis. You know, early on, the first reactions of people in those first couple of weeks were, how can we help? How can we help? What can we do? Everyone was there was such an appetite to help within your community, to help those who are most vulnerable, to help those who are most isolated. And the sense of what it is possible for a community to do when it is given the opportunity and the kind of permission in some ways as well to go, yeah, you are allowed to do this. You're allowed to go and check on that neighbor who you don't speak to, or you never hear anything about. Like, you've got permission to do it. That is an extraordinary thing. And so I think part of what has already started flipping is the sense of what a mobilized community can achieve. And so I think the idea of keeping local economies or supporting local economies, I think there's definitely going to be a mistrust of global supply chains after this. The idea of relying on things, you know, the idea that our country has stopped making anything, everything's made somewhere else. The crisis of trying to get the right material for cuffed gowns to get to our frontline workers when all of that material is in a part of the world that just, you know, we couldn't get it. I think just things like that, like you say, Fatima, that people are talking about around their dinner tables, that is going to lead inevitably to wanting to make sure that the things that we really need when the chips are down are within reach. And so that kind of, that's going to boost localism, I suppose, a way of thinking about local communities, and things that can lead the way there are things like what they've been doing in Preston for the last however long, based on the Cleveland model of anchor institutions through procurement, creating a sort of much more healthy financial and economy for the local communities. I think that is something that will be really important. The idea of using the social enterprise model or the cooperative model in order to keep wealth within certain communities. I think that's already changing. So I think that a more equal distribution of wealth, we can already see the mechanics for that in place, an appetite for it, and the opportunity. So I find that very hopeful.
I was doing a bit of research on Amazon and the big bogey, and how the efforts to unionize in the warehouses has been going across the world. And what they found is, in the few warehouses, because Amazon is notorious for union busting and poor labor standards, in the few places where they've been able to have some sort of collective bargaining power have been the communities where there are, like, the social fabric is tight, where there's some sort of already collectivism in those communities, whether it's based on faith lines, ethnic lines, or just by the makeup of that community. They've been able to take that power they feel as being part of a community into the workplace and collectively bargain for better standards of work. And that has, huge repercussions on then their society and the wealth of their society. So I'm excited to see how these networks we've created and this community resilience that we have strengthened in this can have huge, effects on society on a greater level in terms of what we're willing to try to ask for and what we think we can win together.
The big thing to flip for me, and I think this is heartening, and it's a fundamental way of how we see the economy, and that's the idea that economic self-interest must be subservient to public health and well-being, that the economy is there to serve people and not the other way around. Other things which have flipped as well, which have been revealed, is the bias towards the car in our local communities and neighborhoods, and the sheer amount of space that we've been giving to them, and remembering that cars, by and large, the very poorest people in society don't actually have access to cars, by and large. And so when social distancing and space on pavements becomes an issue, and you realize these great swathes of space given over to great sports utility vehicles parked up on the pavement, you see how these imbalances, these inequalities, these biases have kind of crept in over time. And it's interesting to see how some of the worst mortality rates and some of the worst fallouts from the current crisis have been in those Anglo-Saxon economies, the UK and the US. Now, in terms of other things which are flipping, I think many of the things that we've taken for granted around sort of just consumption habits and shopping habits have been interesting. The way in which we've acknowledged the need to make available special hours for people who are more vulnerable or people who are key workers, even the language that we've had around the crisis when we've talked about focusing on the importance of the delivery of essential goods and services. Well, that automatically raises the idea that a lot of the other stuff that we've been consuming has not been essential, and perhaps we didn't need it all along. When we start talking the language of unnecessary travel, and you have even the head of some of the big car lobby organizations like the AA turning around and saying that in the post-pandemic period, it's extremely unlikely that levels of car use will return to what they were before.
One interesting thing for me that has flipped is that people understand what an epidemiologist is now. They understand what we do. Like everybody else, I think the most profound shift has been what is actually an epidemic of social solidarity breaking out. And, I think it's important. My husband keeps saying we shouldn't be talking about social distancing. We should be talking about physical distancing, because socially, actually, a lot more of us are coming together in ways that we didn't previously. So physical distancing, social solidarity, I think that's been the biggest change. But also, perhaps we're being reminded that we live in a very interconnected world. Things that happen in a region of China that most of us never heard of before, they matter. The ways in which we respond to international crises matter for people all over the world. We're not good at that when it's an issue like migration, but perhaps we'll learn ways to cooperate globally as well, as we all have to sort of come to terms with recovery and moving beyond this particular crisis.
What I would most personally like to see flip is that what has been revealed during this crisis about who within communities really are being effective, real engines of change and support, who on the whole tend to not have much support themselves, that during this crisis, the need for what they do has grown, and yet the support to keep them in place and help them do that has gone away. I hope that on the other side of this, we're able to reshape our society so that those people, those organizations, those groups are given the appropriate amount of support as opposed to what was going on before. And I hope that the appetite is there now, that people are acknowledging with their clapping every Thursday or whatever it might be, that how important, how much we need that. So we need to act upon that and commit to that afterwards. I would love to see that. I would also like to see more pathways for people from working class backgrounds, more deprived areas, more pathways for people to come into all kinds of areas of public life, but from my own point of view, more into the creative industries, so that the stories that we're able to tell about who we are and how we've got through this and how we've experienced life. Those stories are told in a much more diverse way from different economic backgrounds, different social backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, so that that illusion that can sometimes grow up in a really unhealthy way about who we are and what is really going on isn't there to be broken through when a crisis comes, that we're actually ready to meet it because our stories are able to prepare us for it.
I grew up in Essex during Margaret Thatcher's government and the age of sort of selfishness, self-interest and individualism. And what I'd like to see flip is our understanding of ourselves, that we are fundamentally cooperative, we are fundamentally altruistic, we are fundamentally gregarious beings who like looking out for each other and are happiest when everybody else is well too. The other thing I'd like to see flip really quickly is I'd like to see pretty rapidly pulled together some plans for the conversion of industries which are high polluting, high energy ones. We've already seen the ability of car industries being able to kind of turn their purposes to making medical equipment. We've seen everyone from perfumiers to brewers making personal protective equipment and sanitation skills. And I think much more of, and you can think of it at a much bigger level. You think of a city like Aberdeen, which for years has been servicing the offshore oil and gas industry, that's now reinventing itself as a home for renewable energy.
I think that idea of examining the impact of everything we do, all policy making decisions, on inequality and on well-being would be very welcome. In fact, we passed the socioeconomic duty in the Equality Act of 2010, I think, and it's never been implemented. So the legislation is sitting there ready to be implemented. So I'd like to see that flip right now in the imposition of the socioeconomic duty. And then we could add a well-being one and put well-being at the centre of everything we do, and children.
In Wales, we have the Future Generations Act. It's just that it doesn't always have quite the teeth that it needs to have, or it doesn't yet.
I think we are able to find a way of building a society that isn't reliant on fossil fuels, that isn't reliant on plundering our environment, and that we have both human well-being and environmental well-being at the center of the sort of communities that we want.
Maybe we need to change GDP from being the marker.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was working for the New Economics Foundation as its policy director a while ago, we came up with what we called the Happy Planet Index, in which we brought together the measure of well-being, life expectancy and ecological footprint, which gave you a measure of the ecological efficiency with which we deliver relatively long and happy lives. And it's still one of my favorite indicators.
I've always been in favour of a maximum wage. I don't see why not. I'm in favour of a lot of politically unacceptable things, though, like ending private education, taxing land, and inheritance tax of 100%, which is why nobody's ever going to vote for me to be in any kind of position of power. But probably more manageable as a solution is to think about a maximum wage ratio within institutions. Switzerland had a referendum on whether or not that should be capped at 1 in 12, with the idea that nobody should be able to make more in 1 month than other people in the company can make in 1 year. So those don't have to be draconian. They would have a big impact. And the mere fact that we're reporting those things now, I think, is helpful. It's shining a light on inequalities by gender and just within companies as well. So the trouble with imposing a maximum wage, much as I would love to, is I think a lot of people would react quite poorly to it. But I think when you talk about ratios, I think people can see the point of that we shouldn't be valuing some people hundreds or thousands of times more financially than we value those who are our key workers and doing the tasks that keep everything moving along. Should it be illegal to be a billionaire? It should be embarrassing.
So that is a reference to last year when we were putting on the Homeless World Cup in Cardiff. And with a few weeks to go, all the money fell through. And we had 500 of the most vulnerable people around the world looking forward to coming to Cardiff for a potentially transformational experience that I was completely committed to. And so I thought if I was committed to it, then I had to put my money where my mouth is. So I gave everything I had and put everything I had up at risk to make sure that it happened. And it would I recommend that to other people? Well, maybe not that. I had a baby on the way as well, and it was quite scary for quite a while there. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But I sort of see myself now as a sort of social enterprise in myself. So I earn money from what I do as my day job in order to then put money into the things that I care about, to do with my local community and systemic things. And I try to, I mean, one of the things that was a big learning experience for me was working with UNICEF and going to refugee camps in places like Jordan and Bangladesh and places like that. And seeing people in front of you who have nothing, literally nothing. I've had everything taken away from them, and going, how quickly can I get money from my account to help this group of people in front of me, this family? I'm being told, now that doesn't work. It can't work like that. You have to look at the systemic changes. You have to support the work that changes everything for everyone, as opposed to just changing something for one person. So I've always since then tried to find a way to be able to work at both a systemic level and a local level. And I have found personally for me that using my resources, and one of those resources is financial, but there's also media platform, the ability to come on and be part of something like this. There's all kinds of resources that I have. My talent for what I do or whatever, my voice, to use what resources I have to be able to support the values I have and the things I want to see changed. And the more I commit to that, I have found the less at risk I feel. So in a strange way, I have found it seems sort of simplistic and a generalized thing, but the more that you are able to give of what you have towards the things that you want to see different, the more you feel you have. So when we were talking about GDP being a flawed marker for success or richness or whatever you want to call it, wealth, I have found that, the more that I am able to feel like I can give what I am earning in order to create change, the richer I feel. But it may not be financially, but definitely I feel better for that. So I would absolutely recommend that to people, to other people who have money. Yeah. But whatever resources you have, because like I say, money is just one of those resources.
So yes, that's another thing that has happened whilst we've been all stuck indoors. The oil industry is in free fall and prices of oil have gone negative. Oil is literally not worth the barrel it's in. And what we might be finding ourselves in is in a position where oil companies are paying for people to take oil off their hands. And I think what that shows us is how unstable and how our communities lack resilience if we're pinning our prosperity on things like fossil fuels, like oil companies, and how unstable that market entirely is. There is an opportunity, however, and there is a risk in oil being a negative. Oil being negative could see our governments and industry saying, hey, oil is super cheap. How about we double down, and now we buy lots of oil and we cement and lock in further extraction and more oil use. Or we could say, this is not a stable model for our economy. And actually, I think what governments around the world should be doing is seizing those assets. They should be buying them. This is a great time to buy and nationalize these oil companies, increase assets for these governments, and then governments control how much extraction is happening and to what end, but also transition these industries. These industries will not transition alone. They will not change their model as much as we tell ourselves that they will. And what governments could do actually is come in and buy them out and transition those workers to make sure that the workers are not left behind when oil companies go bust, because that's what will happen. And it isn't the executives that will lose out. The executives will be fine. It will just be loads and loads of people without work. and who will lose their jobs. And the government, I think, now has an opportunity while oil's cheap. I'd say go buy them right now, and then transition them out and invest right now in renewable energy. So, a source that, even if it does go into negative, won't disrupt our economies, because it is renewable. And this is a really, I think, important moment where we could see a transition towards renewables. But there's huge incentives right now to keep using oil, and that's one thing that we should be worried about.
Whether you look back to some of the upheavals of the 19th century, or whether you look at some of the examples that Michael was talking about in World War II and our experience of change in building the National Health Service afterwards, or whether you look at some of the ways in which we had to convert the defense and military industries at the end of the Cold War, whether you look at how people responded to the previous oil crisis, the OPEC oil crisis, or even if you look at some of the things which we experienced during the financial crisis 10 years ago, is that there are an enormous number of range of circumstances, very different circumstances, things happening from external shocks, new technologies, social and demographic changes in which change becomes possible. But as I sit here now, and it may be a bias of my immediate experience, looking around at how people have responded and the speed with which unimaginable things have happened in terms of repurposing of industry, in terms of changes of social behavior, in terms of just kind of pausing and reassessing, I think this is an extraordinary moment for change. And even just on the point that Fatima was talking about in terms of oil, one of the policy ideas that we've been talking about in regard to the change that needs to happen, and which may be facilitated by change patterns of travel after this, is the idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, borrowed from the old nuclear non-proliferation treaty. The idea that we need this line in the sand, here is an opportunity. We've talked about oil as being the danger of it becoming a stranded asset, a liability in effect for people for ages. Well, now it quite literally is. And understanding the links and the importance of putting public health and well-being before short-term economic interests, and understanding that many of the solutions to the climate crisis are also solutions to the corrosive crisis of inequality and to broader problems of public cohesion and our own well-being, understanding that we can have that holy grail of the policy sort of maker's dream, interventions which can solve all these problems simultaneously. And of course, the Green New Deal is one of the big ones, which brings all those things together, tackling inequality, tackling the climate crisis, and thinking about a well-being economy. So yeah, I'm maybe pathologically optimistic, and it's not to understate, the real tragedy of the current concern. And if you look at perhaps some of the official incompetence around the management of the current crisis, maybe even the atrocity of our current concern, this is nevertheless a moment which, it won't just happen. Positive change won't just kind of pop out of it. We will have to work for it, as all good things have to be worked for. And there will be interests that push back in the other direction, trying to go back to business as usual. But as Fatima said earlier, the old normal wasn't a good normal. The new normal has to be a better normal. We have to build back better. And this is a huge opportunity.
I think I'll just finish by saying health is wealth. And that's what we need to be prioritizing. And by health, I mean all aspects of well-being.
For anybody who's watching, I'd say this is a moment for creativity, and if you have the privilege and the bandwidth to be creative, this is the moment where ideas are necessary and good ideas are needed, and to be creative in whatever sort of section of society you find yourself. And just to come off the back of what Andrew said, yes, we need to build back better, and at least for Green New Deal UK, we will be launching our Build Back Better campaign with health workers and unions and frontline communities and mutual aid groups in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to be involved in the effort to have a stake in the recovery, to look out for the Build Back Better campaign.
Our interconnectedness is the most important thing about us as a species. It's both what is the biggest threat to us at the moment, but it is also our hope for the future. And seeing how people's first instinct is to help and to go towards the vulnerable, to go towards who needs help, has been sort of life-changing, I think, for us all, hopefully, as a national community, as a global community.
The Flip.